All right, so we're back with the second type of externality, which is a negative consumption externality. Now, this is going to be pretty similar to a negative production externality. So in order to make the lesson shorter, I'm going to skip over any information that we already covered in the first video. So if you haven't already watched the Unit 2.8.2 lesson on negative production externalities, go back and do that before watching this one, or else it won't really make sense. The link is in the description, or if you're watching from the Microeconomics playlist, you can just go back one video. All right, let's get into it. So, as you can probably guess, a negative consumption externality is when consuming a good creates costs for people outside the transaction, people who aren't directly involved as buyers or sellers. So, it's the same concept as a negative production externality, but now we're talking about consumption instead of production. However, the diagram and effects on stakeholders are totally different, so pay attention. But first of all, what kind of product would cause a negative consumption externality? Think of products that are bad for you. In economics, these are called demerit goods. Things like alcohol, cigarettes, junk food, drugs are examples of demerit goods. But there are also others that you might not think of, like gambling and air travel. Airplanes put a lot of greenhouse gases into the air, and the more people who travel on airplanes, which are the people consuming the product, the more negative effects it has on the environment. This is a cost society has to pay for, even for people that have never been on an airplane. This is why it's a negative externality of consumption, and why a carbon tax is usually included in the price of your plane ticket. But we'll talk more about that later in the video. For right now, you just need to understand that demerit goods are overprovided and overconsumed in the free market. In other words, society would be better off if people consumed less. But instead, too many people are consuming these products. These people simply may not care about the costs, but more often, they don't have perfect information and underestimate the harmful effects. This is especially so for products like cigarettes or junk food, because the true costs aren't realized until after many years of consumption. This is why governments will try to discourage the consumption of demerit goods with taxes, regulations, or, as in the case of illegal drugs, an outright ban. Let's see what this looks like on a diagram. Because we're talking about consumption now, we're looking at the demand curve. Okay, now think about why someone would consume demerit goods. Obviously, they would get some benefit from the good, or else they wouldn't consume it, right? So the marginal private benefits will then be greater than the marginal social benefit. And once again, the distance between the two lines is our external cost. You can think of the external cost to society as negative benefits. Therefore, the benefits to society will also be less than the private benefits of the person consuming the product. And because we're focused on the consumption side, we don't need to worry about the supply curve. So our supply curve is going to be the same line for both marginal private costs and marginal social cost. Now we can see the market price and quantity give us our market equilibrium here. And then the socially optimum price and socially optimum quantity gives us our socially optimum point here. How about the welfare loss? Do you remember the cheat codes? The point of the triangle will always be at the socially optimum point, and a negative externality will always point left. So that means our welfare loss will be the area of the triangle here, which can be found using the formula base times height divided by 2. Okay, that's pretty easy, but let's go a little deeper to explore why it's that area. All right, so as you know, the demand curve is a benefits curve. So then the area above the demand curve means there are no benefits in this area for consumers since it's above the demand line. All the benefits are represented below the demand curve. This area here shows us the benefits the individual consumer gets from consuming the product. And remember, diminishing marginal benefits, so the consumer gets less and less benefits as more of the product is consumed, which is why it slopes downward. And this smaller triangle, which is below the marginal social benefits curve, represents the benefits for society. But that might be confusing. How could the consumption of a demerit good by one person have any benefit for society? Let's take a demerit good like alcohol. So yes, it's true that the individual consumption of alcohol doesn't really offer much benefit for society. But we need to look at the bigger picture. First of all, someone had to make the alcohol. That gave someone a job. That person probably had to get raw materials to produce the alcohol. That gave jobs to other people. Someone had to make the glass to put the alcohol in. Someone had to make the label. Then people had to transport all these things. Those people needed to buy a truck to do that. Someone had to make the truck, which involves a lot of different parts from different sources. That gave a lot of people a lot of jobs. I think you get the idea. So, whenever there is consumption of a product, no matter how bad it is, there will be at least some benefit gained by society in the process. But of course, the benefits gained by society will always be less than the private benefits, and that's why it's a negative externality of consumption. And then the welfare loss shows that there's an over-allocation of resources, and society would be better off if less of the good was consumed. You can see our welfare loss triangle is pointing to a lower quantity. But notice that the price also drops. What's up with that? Wouldn't society want a higher price to discourage people from smoking? Yes, the socially optimum price is lower than the market price. This illustrates that the good is overvalued in the free market. Society doesn't value the good as much and therefore thinks the price should be lower. Another way to think of this is to imagine trying to sell cigarettes to a smoker and a non-smoker. Obviously, you could sell to the smoker at a much higher price, but you would need to drop the price quite a bit before the non-smoker bought it, right? That's because the non-smoker values the cigarettes much less, and therefore thinks the price should be lower. So now we can begin to understand why that area is a welfare loss. The horizontal gap between the market quantity and the socially optimum quantity represents the overconsumption of the good by private consumers. The vertical distance between the market price and the socially optimum price represents the overvaluation of the good by private consumers. Society would be better off if the good was valued less, which would mean suppliers would allocate less resources to its production. And this overproduction is represented by the welfare loss triangle. Okay, so now let's talk about what governments do to correct this market failure. Once again, we have market-based policies and government legislation and regulation. Let's start with market-based solutions. Luckily, this time it's a bit easier since there's only one type of market-based solution, an indirect tax, also called a Pigouvian tax. So effectively, it works in exactly the same way as a negative production externality, but we just need to be a bit more careful drawing the diagram. So here's our normal negative externality of consumption diagram, with one supply curve that equals the marginal social cost and the marginal private costs, and we also have the marginal private benefits curve that is higher than the social benefits curve. Okay, so on a test, be careful because you need to remember that an indirect tax, like a Pigouvian tax, drives a wedge between the producer and consumer. This means that the price paid by the consumer, PC, is higher than the price received by the producer, PP. This effectively adds to the cost of production, so we draw another curve to represent that. This is the marginal private cost plus tax. So it's a little tricky because most students focus on the demand curves for consumption, but you need to think about what the indirect tax is actually doing. Because the indirect tax lowers the amount received by producers, they then need to raise the price to receive enough money to cover their costs. This is effectively the same as an increase in the cost of production, and that's what the MPC plus tax curve represents. Ideally, the amount of indirect tax should be equal to the external costs in order to offset the externality. That's not easy to get right though, but we'll talk about that later. Back to the diagram. You can see what this does to the price. Now, at the market quantity, the price level is higher than the demand, so the market price is going to force the quantity demanded to a more socially optimum point, but at an even higher price. If the tax is equal to the external cost, then the quantity supplied will fall to the socially optimum point, which means allocative efficiency is achieved. Now, let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages. Well, just as with negative production externalities, the goal here is to internalize the externality. And indirect taxes do a good job of that, because now the consumer has to buy at a higher price and the supplier receives a lower price. In other words, by having the consumer pay more, this decreases their benefits, bringing the marginal private benefit closer to the marginal social benefit curve. Because of the loss of benefits, the consumer will then consume less units. Sounds like it works great, right? Well, not so fast. Of course, there's always going to be disadvantages as well. Right off the bat, how can a government calculate the value of the external costs? Take cigarettes, for example. How can we measure how much secondhand smoke has affected other members of society? As you can imagine, this would be very difficult. So then it would also be very difficult to set a tax that is equal to the external cost of the consumption of the good. And it just so happens that a lot of demerit goods have inelastic demand. Putting an indirect tax on this type of goods will increase government revenue, but it usually has little effect on decreasing the actual consumption of the good. So another disadvantage is that indirect taxes aren't very effective in reducing consumption. To see a significant decrease, the government would need to set an extremely high tax rate, which would be very politically unpopular. To help make up for these disadvantages, the government usually also uses legislation and regulation to discourage consumption. We see this most commonly with age restrictions. Governments will usually set laws to restrict the consumption of products like alcohol, cigarettes, and gambling to only adults. And even after that, many governments offer additional restrictions to discourage use. Smoking is now banned in public places in many countries, which is done specifically to eliminate the harmful effects of secondhand smoke. Most countries require some sort of permit to sell alcohol and may restrict sales to certain days and times. Some countries only allow gambling in certain authorized zones that are heavily regulated. And then, of course, there are certain products, like illegal drugs, that have an outright ban, and you may face the death penalty if you are caught in possession of them. These regulations can be very effective in reducing the consumption of demerit goods. However, they are not without their disadvantages. First of all, not all demerit goods are easily regulated. Sure, the ones we just mentioned are easy, but how about regulating the consumption of petrol or jet fuel that pollutes the air? Doing so would most likely do more damage to the economy than good. This is why governments prefer to tax these types of goods. And even with products that clearly have negative health effects like cigarettes, alcohol, or illegal drugs, the government needs to be very careful with how they handle the restriction of these products. Too much restriction will create a black market, which is easily seen with illegal drugs. The restriction itself sometimes increases demand. A good example of this is the U.S. prohibition of alcohol in the 1920s, which had the opposite effect of what was intended. Also, due to the restriction, the price increases, which then incentivizes more producers to take the risk of supplying it due to higher profit margins. So, as you can see, if the government isn't careful, the legislation created to discourage consumption may actually end up increasing consumption. The next method to correct a negative externality of consumption is education and awareness. These educational programs can be funded by the tax revenue gained by the Pigouvian tax placed on the product. However, this then incurs an opportunity cost since that money could be spent elsewhere. While these types of programs can work very well, the effectiveness of such programs is very questionable and dependent on many other factors. Even if successful, the effects may not be seen for many years. Another type of correction method is nudges, which is HL content. We've discussed nudges before, but in case you don't remember, it's a more subtle form of influencing behavior by designing choices to encourage the desired behavior. The advantage here is the consumers are allowed to make the choice themselves and maintain their free will. However, with that comes the risk that they might not choose the desired behavior. Also, it may be difficult to design the choice architecture in an effective way. There will also be differences in reactions to a particular nudge across different demographic groups, meaning it will be very difficult to find a one-size-fits-all solution. But as you may have noticed, government regulation, educational awareness, and even nudges all aim to decrease demand. So let's try to draw that on a diagram. Here we have the demand curve, which equals the marginal private benefits of consuming the product. Then we have our supply curve, which also equals the MPC and MSC. So the market price and quantity will be here. Okay, and since the benefits for society will be less, we're going to draw our marginal social benefits curve under the private benefits curve. And the vertical distance between the MSB and MPB will be equal to the external cost. And the intersection of the supply curve and the marginal social benefits curve will be our socially optimum point, where MSB is equal to MSC, and allocative efficiency is achieved. All right, now what effects does regulation and education have on the diagram? As we discussed already, each has varying degrees of effectiveness, but they all aim to decrease marginal private benefits. This is going to push the MPB curve down closer to the MSB curve, closing the gap and reducing the external cost. The new market price and quantity then gets closer to the socially optimum point. Although it is unlikely that the negative consumption externality will ever disappear completely, the reduction means that society is now better off. All right, that's going to about do it for this lesson on negative externalities of consumption. Next video, we'll start looking at positive externalities. But before moving on to that, check out the learning objectives below and make sure you know each one. As always, leave your questions in the comments, and thanks for watching.